Please be seated. The court is now back in session. The floor is now given to Keel Sampon's defense. To put questions to this expert, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honours. Good morning to all parties, and good morning, of course, Mr. Short. I would like to start first by thanking the Chamber for the 30 extra minutes that were allotted to us, even if, honestly speaking, we are still frustrated a little bit, but I still wanted to start by thanking the Chamber for this. Now, to start, Mr. Short, I would like first, of course, to introduce myself. I am Anta Guisset. I am the International Counsel for Mr. Sampon, and this is it is in this capacity that I'll be putting questions to you. And I would like to react to something that you said yesterday, and that somehow caught my attention. You said that history is the art of the possible. And that's a beautiful quote for a historian, I must say. But we are here in a criminal trial, and your book was quoted often in the closing order, which, of course, is the reason why our clients are being tried. So you will understand that regarding some of your statements, and, of course, regarding some of passages of your books, I'm going to react, and possible is not something that is sufficient when there's a risk of condemnation, because we need things that are certain, things that are more accurate. This is what I wanted to tell you to start with. First point, which you spoke about a bit with my colleague from the Nguyen Chair Defense, regarding your working technique, and I imagine that as a historian or as a biographer, you have your own working methods. And my first question is, when you're a historian of contemporary history, which of course would be different from someone studying ancient history, but you are working, of course, with human material, I should say, because you're speaking to people who are alive and who actually lived through the period. So my question is, and regarding your work in particular, Anatomy of a Nightmare. So you started working on the book in 1999, 2000, if I understood properly. That is to say, quite a while after the facts. So didn't you have to confront problems of memory? Wasn't there an issue with the memory of that period from the people whom you interviewed?
There certainly was a problem of memory. It is always much preferable to work from contemporary documents, whether they are contemporary letters or newspapers or political documents, than to work with oral history, that is, with people's memories, because people's memories are fallible. And all one can do is try to the French word recouper, to put things together and ensure that you have, that the sources you have are as credible as possible. I would merely add, as for possible, with respect, a law court is also engaged in what is possible. There are no absolutes in any field of human endeavor. You try to get as close to the truth as you can, so do I as a historian.
We don't have time to go into this philosophical discussion, but the difference with history and a courtroom is that when there is a doubt, then the doubt falls in favor of the accused. But I will leave it at that because, of course, time is rather short. So let me continue. You worked with people who knew the inside of the regime. Indeed, you specified that this was characteristic of your whole approach. And before going into the talks that you may have had with Mr. Kyosampan, I would like to know if you view yourself as an expert in terms of a biography of Pol Pot or in terms of the functioning of democratic Cambodia, or would you draw a distinction between the two?
My purpose was to write a biography of Pol Pot. In order to do that, it was necessary to research and to become as familiar as possible with the functioning of DK. So the two are complementary.
You covered a good many aspects of democratic Cambodia. Is it true that when you were writing your book, you had to make choices between which points should be gone into more thoroughly in your work than others, in terms of which were more closely connected with the person of Pol Pot?
In any book, you make choices. There are things you leave out. There are things you include. I did not. Yes, it is true. If you're writing a biography, you focus on those elements which will cast light on the personality of your subject. But when you're writing a biography of a political leader, the policies he follows, the system that he leads, are some of the things which cast most light on that personality. So there is the distinction is less than it might seem.
Coming back to the questions of interviews you made with the protagonists of the time, I think you pointed out recently that it was easier with some than with others in certain historical periods of democratic Cambodia. Again, this is a question about contemporary historical work. Is it not simply human to have some people who were on one side or the others talking to you more freely? There is more engagement, less engagement. Others want to accentuate their role, others want to minimize it. Is this something that you take account of in your prior research?
I think it's something you take into account, not so much in prior research, but in your assessments of interviews. Because in interviews, and this was one of the points which I think your colleague of the defense brought up, you are not always, indeed almost always, you are not being told the entire truth. People filter what they wish you to understand, and it is your job to try and interpret what they say, to work out what lies behind their words, what can be taken at face value, what is being said in order to project a particular view. It's not simply a matter of taking raw data and accepting it all at face value.
Similarly, in your documentary sources or in papers that you may have looked at, I imagine that you try and cross-check in different ways. If something is revealed on one side, presumably you look for other ways to support such a revelation from another source.
Where that is possible, yes, but it's not always possible. And that is as true of a recent period like the Khmer Rouge as it would be of research onto a 18th or 19th century figure.
Je voudrais maintenant venir plus spécifiquement aux...
I'd like now to turn more specifically to the interviews you had with Khieu Samphan. Answering questions in the last few days, you said that you met Khieu Samphan 5 or 6 times, if I remember correctly. Could you tell us what particular periods those meetings took place in? Were they several months apart, or was it all very close together? What was the kind of frequency that we are talking about?
To the best of my recollection, we met virtually every day for every morning for a week, probably five times. And I then came back, and I can't remember whether it was 1 month or 6 months later, and we had a final meeting, after which Mr. Khieu Samphan said he thought it would be unwise for him, it might put him in difficulty to continue our discussions.
Est-ce que
During these meetings, were you already talking about the possibility of a tribunal being set up?
No, we did not. But I do remember Mr. Khieu Samphan saying, and this was at the last meeting, that the reason, I'm paraphrasing, but he didn't want to continue, is I had to realize his situation was extremely difficult and delicate, and he said, my life could be in danger.
And as you see it, is it that particular context that explains what you told us before, namely that he was more inclined to talk about the period before 75 to 79 than the Democratic Kampuchea period?
Yes, certainly.
quand vous l'avez rencontré,
when you met Mr. Khieu Samphan, did you do prior research on his career, and had you met people who had known him and who had biographical elements to offer you on Khieu Samphan before you actually met him for the talks?
Yes, I must have done, because, and I say I must have done because it took about 18 months before we met for the first time. So I was already fairly well advanced. I had read quite a lot of material from the DC archives, from other sources of original Khmer Rouge material, CPK material. I had obviously read books that had previously been written about Cambodia and dealt with Mr. Khieu Samphan's role. I had looked at his thesis in Paris. I had done a certain amount of research, and I had talked to at least 2 people who were in the Khmer Rouge and had known him, not that well, but had known him during that period.
May I ask you who those 2 people were?
I'm thinking in particular of Swang Si-kun, who has, I think, given evidence before this tribunal, and Ping Soy.
You just mentioned the thesis that Khieu Samphan wrote. Let's come back to this. I think you brought this point up with Judge Cartwright on Monday, and What you told the court was slightly less clear than what you said in your book, so I'd like to come back to a point in your book, and this is taken from document E3/9. The French ARN is 00639-828. And in English, 00396-497. You say that Khieu Samphan pleaded in favor of self-reliance in the thesis he put before the Sorbonne in 1959, and international integration, he wrote, is the prime route of Khmer's economic subdevelopment. Foreign aid made the country dependent on global markets over which Cambodia had no control, since they were dominated by foreign interests. Foreign trade deprived local industries from work by inundating the market with low-cost imports. This is a sort of summary of the contents of the thesis. On the following page, when you brought up, incidentally, this question with Judge Cartwright, you said that this thesis should not be seen as a model for what actually happened afterwards. Now, in your book, you are considerably more specific than that. So I'm turning the page to 00639-829 in French and to 00396-428 in English. And Khieu Samphan went so far as to state that Cambodia needed a sort of autonomous national capitalism. So, Mr. Short, quite obviously, we seem to be very far from self-reliant communism in Mr. Khieu Samphan's thinking.
It would be very helpful if you could give me the pages in the book, because I'm not able to follow.
C'est vrai, excusez-moi, j'ai oublié que...
I'm sorry, yes, I didn't remember that you didn't have the codified paging. It's page 289 and 290 in the English version. So the last passage I read on the subject of capitalism is on page 290.
Yes, I don't see any contradiction. Mr. Khieu Samphan wrote about self-conscious autonomous development, which is a more acceptable way, acceptable to the Sihanouk government, of saying autarky. And I did say in the book that this was not a blueprint. This was not taken as, should not be seen as a blueprint for what the Khmer Rouge, the DK regime, did later, but that it was, it contained the sorts of ideas which were under discussion at that time. One of the particular differences, if I remember, that I noted was Mr. Khieu Samphan in his thesis put considerable emphasis on technology, which in DK practice was not the case. So there were many differences, but the broad approach was consonant with what happened later.
Capitalism in democratic Cambodia?
Well, I would remind you that the Soviet Union practiced what was often called state capitalism.
Et vous...
And do you believe that, economically speaking, that is what happened in democratic Cambodia, state capitalism?
No. Mr. Khieu Samphan used the term national capitalism, which could be interpreted as the nation, the collective, holding the capital of the country in this case being its agricultural production capacity in particular, and developing it on behalf of the nation. I mean, I think we shouldn't play too much with individual words. The thrust of that entire thesis is that Cambodia should develop autonomously. It should not become a tributary of foreign states, that its responsibility is for its own development, and, as he repeatedly says, the nation is the key, the individual is not. These are perfectly defensible propositions. I have nothing against them. But you can see a certain correlation between those kinds of ideas which were being discussed in the early 1960s by Cambodian radicals, including Mr. Khieu Samphan, and what happened later.
Let's come back to economics at a later stage. I'm trying to move more or less chronologically, even if I have to drop one or 2 points. In your testimony and in your book, you talked about Khieu Samphan's return to Cambodia and the way he threw himself into drafting a newspaper, although he might have aspired to other more lucrative endeavors. And talking about that period, you referred to links that might have existed at the time, and you developed that as well for Huyun and Yunim, links that might have existed with the clandestine Communist Party. And when you were questioned by the co-prosecutor, you said that it was really quite difficult to know what ties there were. There were certainly no direct ties, they were all indirect and so forth. Now, my question is, if it is so difficult to know, what were your sources on this point when you came to write your book?
Before 1967, when Khieu Samphan and Hunim and Huyun went to the countryside, there are no direct, specific sources about the nature of that relationship. I would describe it as these were intellectuals who were sympathetic to some of the ideas of the Cambodian Communist Party, who put out, in the case of Mr. Khieu Samphan, a journal which was often very critical of the prince's, the society which the prince's policies had created, while sparing the prince's person, and I would say did so very courageously, in a very upright manner, a very honest manner. Hunim and Huyun both were regarded by Sihanouk's opposition, left-wing opposition. But what we do not know, Mr. Khieu Samphan didn't explain it to me, and I have no other source, is the exact nature of those links. One speaks in French, and forgive me, of a mouvance. In other words, a movement connected to, but not directly linked to, a political party. And that is how I would have described his position. Only after 1967, when he is escorted and taken out to a Khmer Rouge area, a Khmer Rouge safe area, did the relationship become clear?
D'accord. Donc quand vous parlez,
So when you use this word mouvance, you mean a movement of ideas rather than precise contact with that group, if I understand correctly.
A community of ideas, yes, but which also necessarily involves some form of indirect contact. And if you ask me what form of indirect contact, I cannot say. I don't think anybody, except for Mr. Khieu Samphan himself, is really able at this stage to say that. If I might just add very briefly, had there been no link of any kind, it is difficult to imagine that when necessity arose, as it did in 1967, he could have left and Hu Yun left with him so quickly. If they had been completely separate, it's very, I can't imagine a scenario where two groups completely unknown to each other could suddenly, in a matter of hours, have come together to arrange their exfiltration, as it were, from Phnom Penh.
But basically, between the time when Khieu Samphan came back to Cambodia and the time when he was obliged to go into the Maki, we don't actually know when the contact started, nor by what means. Is my understanding correct?
Your understanding is broadly correct. I would just add one little qualification. Mr. Khieu Samphan was close in France to Ying Seri, and Ying Seri was indeed part of the CPK. And took part in the Congress in 1960. So that we do know there were at least friendships linking him with members of the CPK. We also know that he was a member of the French Communist Party in Paris, which does more than suggest, which indicates an ideological convergence. I agree, these are not, clear, dark lines on a map saying he knew him and this one did that. That kind of detail is beyond me and I think beyond everybody else. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you. All of the questions I am asking you are related to what one can read in your book, and I am, of course, looking to see if this is rooted in fact or if it is speculative or supposition, and that is going to be the essential thrust of all of my questions today. Now, what I want to do now is move from Khieu Samphan's entrance into politics, his progressist alliance with Hu Yun and Hu Nim, who he tries to bring within the Sihanouk government fold. And then there are the threats from the military court, which lead to a price being put on Khieu Samphan's head. We heard about this from the witness Mi Vun on the 9th of October 2012. The reference is E1/132/1 at 11:19, and he said that at that time a price had been put on Mr. Khieu Samphan's head. You yourself have told us that we were in a period where the regime was extremely violent. You talked about the repression that came down on people, and so we are looking at a rather closed period in political terms. And talking with the co-prosecutor, you yourself said that at one particular point rebellion was almost the only method of expressing yourself in that regime. Is this a fair summary?
It is absolutely fair. No other political space was left open to Sihanouk's opponents, and when that happens, rebellion, illegal political activity, is the only option to those determined to oppose.
Can we now focus on the CPK and the link with the intellectuals? In the early days, as you said there was mouvance within the CPK. You had the progressive people, Kyosampan, Hunem and Huyun, who, even if they militated in left-wing circles in France, were not nevertheless members of the party, but who were taken under its wing because it was the CPK, after all, that was going to provide them shelter and protection during the period of danger. And in the rapport between the CPK and intellectuals, you talked about Song Si-kun, who came to testify here, and he said some interesting things about the distinction that he drew within the CPK between what he called strategic forces and tactical forces. The transcript dates back to the 14th of August 2013, reference E3/107.1. The French ERN is 00838433, and in English 00838 to 306, and in Khmer 35101 to 102. And this is how he explained the distinction between tactical and strategical forces vis-à-vis the intellectuals. A tactical force concerns intellectuals in general, in particular those who went to study in France and those who belong to the Marxist-Leninist circle. At the time, the CPK needed those intellectuals to come towards the popular masses because they would be more effective than ordinary students. The red intellectuals, as they were called, were good students. They were good-natured and respected the elderly, and they were pleasant towards the other students. It was a kind of backup force which was distinguished from the strategic forces. They could become part of the strategic force when they were within the country and when they were able to change status and mentality so as to become proletarians and members of the working classes. Now, the reason I'm quoting this to you is that in your book, you talked about Kyosampan's time in the Maquis and the way he lived with communists drawn from the ranks of the peasantry, and the discipline of all that was a discovery to him. Now, in the light of what Song Si-kun said, my question is, was this the discovery of a new world for Kyosampan, and his wish not to make too many waves as an intellectual? Does this not draw from some kind of intellectual's embarrassment from being along with the real masses who were all around him and who were offering him protection as well?
President, the expert, please wait the prosecution. You may proceed.
It was a long question, but if I understood correctly, my learned friend is asking Mr. Short to opine on what was in Khieu Samphan's mind as he came into contact with peasantry and discovered discipline. It is improper to ask the expert to opine on what was in one's mind at the time, so the question should be disallowed.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I'm quite shocked by the prosecutor's objection. During the entire testimony of the expert, when he was being questioned by the prosecutor, very often the expert said what was happening in Khieu Samphan's mind, or this is why I thought he acted this way. He said, so here again, we're not dealing with any ordinary witness, we're dealing with an expert who wrote about this period, who wrote about the reasons, or in his opinion at least, the reasons behind what happened. And so again, when we read the transcripts of the past days, you will see that this criticism here is absolutely irrelevant.
President, the objection and its ground by the prosecution to the last question by the International Council for Khieu Samphan is valid. The question is much further outside the expertise of the expert. Mr. Expert, you are instructed not to respond to the last question put to you by Khieu Samphan's International Council. And Council, please move to another question.
j'avance, Monsieur le Président.
Fine. Okay. We will return later to what you said during the previous days. Now I would like to focus on the youth of the CPK and its relations with the Vietnamese Communist Party. You speak about it in your book, and you also refer to the period when Pol Pot was in contact with the Vietnamese Communist Party and the moment before the 1960 Congress when there was a desire to counter Vietnamese domination, and there was a will to assert independence, to assert the independence of a Khmer party. And you explained today, again, to my colleague, the link, the difficult historic relation between Cambodia and Vietnam. So, in the genesis of the CPK, and in its rejection of a Indo-Chinese Communist Party, do you see here the reflection of a historical pattern that indeed had an influence on Pol Pot's choice to distance himself?
Yes, this is a vast subject, and one could give many examples, but both in the 19th century and during the French period, where the French chose to use Vietnamese junior civil servants rather than employing Cambodian civil servants for their administration. There are so many aspects to this, but constantly, a constant theme in history has been Vietnam's feelings of superiority, of being the elder brother to the Cambodian younger brother, and its desire to exert what you could call dominance, what you could call hegemony over the other countries of Indochina, namely Laos and Cambodia. And what became the CPK, the Cambodian Communists, if you go back to the 1930s, they were a Vietnamese creation, entirely an artificial Vietnamese creation, which then took on progressively more and more Cambodian aspects. Then again, the Vietnamese played a very large role through the late 40s, early 50s, the Khmer Viet Minh. Again, the party was under the Vietnamese, and finally the opportunity arose because Vietnamese attention was very much on the struggle inside Vietnam. It was no longer on so focused on what was happening in Cambodia. The opportunity arose for the Cambodians to strike out in the direction of independence, Cambodian communists, I mean, which is what they did in 1960. So it's part of a very, very consistent pattern.
Now I would like to turn to the internal issues within the CPK and to the two factions of the rebellion that you describe. And this can be found in French. The ERN is 00. It's in the same document, E3/9, 00639 688. In English, 00396 379. And in English, it's on page 179. So you speak about the People's War in 1968-1969 in the way that the communist movement was gathered. And you say, for the first time, free translation, a revolutionary movement, authentically nationalist, was seeing the day, but it was imperfect. There was an unavoidable alliance, but against nature, whose justification is maintaining, on the part of Tsar and his companions, to maintain uncommon shrewdness. So what do you mean by an alliance that was counter to nature?
Yes, an unavoidable but unnatural alliance between the returned students who came from one background. They were Sa and Salah Sa and Ying Sari and some of the others, and those who had come down, whose heritage was from the Isaraks. Their background was totally different. It was difficult for them to stay on the same wavelength, harmonize their views, but there was a precedent for it. If you go back to the French Revolution, you had an alliance between bourgeois intellectuals and the peasants, the sans-culottes, if you like, under Hébert, with Hébert. So that was the basis. It was the alliance of these two groups, which was often difficult to keep together and harmonize, which formed the driving force of the Cambodian Revolution.
And you also mentioned later on that during the coup d'etat, and as you know, Sihanouk's regime was extremely repressive and not very inclined to allying itself with the communists and the leftists. And then there was a coup d'etat, and then everything changed. And you said when you answered the co-prosecutor's question that Sihanouk did not have any illusions about what he would expect from the Khmer Rouge. So my question is that if he decided to make this alliance, it meant that he had a certain objective in mind. So could you kind of expand on his interest in allying himself with the Khmer Rouge then?
Well, I think there were several factors involved, and you'll forgive me if I don't remember all of them, but the two which stick out in my mind were the betrayal by Lon Nol and Sirik Matak, and a very strong desire on Sihanouk's part not to be pushed off the chessboard in that kind of way. It was not something he was prepared to accept, particularly Father Poncho said this after the vilification to which he was subjected by the new regime. That, if you like, is the emotional factor. But more profoundly, Sihanouk was determined to maintain a role, whatever that role might be, in Cambodian politics. And I think above all, though you may say this is speculation, but I think his whole life shows this, to maintain the monarchy. Whatever else had to be sacrificed, his ancestral imperative was to maintain the Cambodian monarchy, the inheritance of his ancestors. And I think, very fundamentally, that was one reason he decided, no matter what the price, I will ally myself with the Khmer Rouge, and I will continue to be a player.
And in your book, French ERN 00639 712, English 00396 398, and you mention or you refer to a speech by the Prince on Radio Peking, and it's on page 198, in fact. And you say, next day, the prince told Zhu his mind was made up. In a message to the Cambodian people broadcast by Radio Beijing, he denounced the coup makers and promised to fight for justice, by which he meant revenge. So this term is a powerful one. So how did you come to the conclusion that he had this desire to seek revenge?
Well, I confess to being influenced. I can only say on that, it's my interpretation. Now, you may say...
The President, Mr. Expert, please hold on. The President. Mr. Expert, could you please repeat your last answer to the question, because your testimony to the last question did not get through the interpretation.
The question, as I remember it, was on what basis do you say that he wanted revenge? I have said earlier, and allow me to repeat, I cannot know what was in the minds of any of those who were actors in this drama, whether it was Sihanouk, whether it was Khieu Samphan, whether it was Pol Pot. All I can do as a historian, as a biographer, is state the sequence of events and try to provide an interpretation. And in this case, my interpretation is, as I've given to you, that he felt betrayed, he wanted revenge, and he wished to remain a player. Father Poncho's, who was present in Cambodia, his interpretation I found to be convincing, and I extrapolated from that. But I can't know what was in the prince's mind.
Now I would like to move on to another passage in your book in which you speak about the period before 1975. It's in your preface, prologue, in French, 00639455 and 256. English, zero 396 197, and the following. And this is what you say. Free translation. During the 5 years of civil war that opposed the communists to Lon Nol's rightist government, most observers in Cambodia, as well as abroad, were convinced that the movement was led by Khieu Samphan, a left-wing intellectual known for his integrity. And his plea for more social justice, back when Sihanouk was in power, earned him a lot of popular support. And he went into the Maquis in 1967, and after the overthrow of the prince 3 years later, he became the main spokesperson for the Khmer Rouge. Minister of Defense and Commander-in-Chief, in name of the Resistance Army, Samphan traveled to Peking to meet Mao, and he published releases presenting in detail the progress on the battlefield. In 1973, when Sihanouk sealed an alliance that was unnatural with his former communist enemies, and when he visited the liberated zones, he was received by Samphan, but this was only a smokescreen. Power was in the hands of other men, and everyone ignored their names. Everyone in the highest spheres of the communist leadership. So my question regarding this passage, and which mirrors a question that you mentioned over the past 2 days, initially mentioned over the past 2 days, the law of secrecy, that is to say, not showing what exactly was happening, giving an appearance. Is this truly the principle, Pol Pot's principle, to remain in the rear and not to show himself so that people would not know where the real power was?
Absolutely. I couldn't put it better.
Now, let me proceed. There is another excerpt in which it's on the following page, in which you refer to Salot Sar, who was a bit like a film director, but in fact was acting as an extra. He is, of course, holding the reins, but he appears just to be an extra. And Now, logically, of course, this leads me to speak about Pol Pot's character, and I hope that the prosecution will not object, because, as you know, you are a biographer of Pol Pot, and there's a certain number of written material that describes his character already. In particular, David Chandler, who spoke about his character, and I only have the English ERN, unfortunately, for this, 00393 065. It's in his book, in the book Brother Number 1, and Chandler explains Pol Pot's charisma and how he fascinated people, and he says that this made it possible for many Cambodians to follow him. So my question is, during your research, did you also notice Pol Pot's possible charisma? And do you believe that this had an important influence on how he was able to lead people to follow him in his ideology and in his in his politics?
I don't think it's...
Oh,
We have a problem. Can we start again? Yeah. I said I don't think there's any doubt about that. When I encountered Pol Pot in Beijing in 1977, his charm, people write about it always, his smile, which was simply angelic, it was a winning smile, was very, very noticeable. You couldn't remain immune to it. And there are many, many descriptions from Cambodians of how after one meeting they were completely subjugated. So yes, I think as with many leaders, charisma, personal magnetism were extremely important.
Now, in terms of his working methods, so you spoke with Mr. Song Sikun about this, and you say in your book on page 340, French ERN 00639 901, and in English 00396 548. And this is what you write. Sun Sikun deemed that micromanagement of the smallest details was a full party of Pol Pot's leadership, strong-handedness without sharing power. Free translation. He wanted to monopolize everything. End of quote. And then you add, this is no longer Sun Sikun speaking, this tendency only worsened over the course of time. So my question is the following. Aside from what Sun Sikun said, what allows you, or what allowed you to be aware of this need to monopolize everything and to notice that this only got worse over the course of time?
I'm thinking of an incident later when I think it was the Thai foreign minister was making a visit to Siem Reap, and I can't put the year, but it was Pol Pot himself who insisted on going through in minute detail exactly what the arrangements would be, down to what kind of linen and towels would be in the rooms for him and his suite, and what food would be served, and so on. These would be things which more normally would be delegated to others. It has to be said, Sihanouk showed the same kind of micromanagement in many cases. So it was not unique to Pol Pot, but it was an aspect of his rule.
A last question, or a last point I'd like to deal with before the lunch break. You said, and as you know, we were speaking about the period when Khieu Samphan seemed to be the public figure for the Maquis movement, and you also speak about the period at the beginning of 1975, and in the English version of your book, it's on page I'm sorry, I don't have the page here, but maybe you're in French, first of all, 00639 849, and in English 00396 513. And it's on page 305 in your book, and you speak about the fictional portfolios, and this is what you say of the various figures, and you say, and you mention Sun Sikun. Khieu Samphan was not any more responsible for defense than the Western Zone Secretary, Chu Chet, was for religious affairs. There were ghost portfolios announced in January 1975, 4 months before victory, to make it appear that the Khmer Rouge had a viable government in waiting. So here again, we spoke about the rebellion, but now when we speak about the period just before seizing power, a facade is still maintained. So what was the reason behind doing this during that period? Is this still... Was it still important to maintain secrecy, or was there another reason behind continuing in this way?
It was still important to maintain secrecy. It was important to maintain secrecy throughout the DK period. But at that particular time, it was, as I say, to show that, or to give the impression that there was a functioning government ready to assume power. And ever since the FUNC and the GRUNC, I mean, the National Front government was formed in the very early 70s, 1971, that was completely fictitious. All these ministerial posts existed only on paper. And again, that is a characteristic of democratic Kampuchea throughout. The National Assembly, which Nguyen Chia chaired, had no real existence. I think it was Mr. Chia Sim who remembered attending the first session and everyone being given a clean shirt so they could attend one morning session, and that was it. There was nothing more afterwards. It was a pure, really a pure invention. It did not exist, and the same was true of many of the government functions which were claimed to exist.
Mr. President, I'll turn to another line of questioning now. This may be an opportune moment to have a break.
The President. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Witness. The time is now appropriate for lunch adjournment. The chamber adjourns now and resume at 1:30 this afternoon. Court officer is instructed to assist the expert during his break and have him return to this courtroom by 1:30 this afternoon. Security guards are instructed to bring Mr. Kyu Sampon to a holding cell downstairs and have him returned to this courtroom this afternoon before 1:30. The court is now adjourned.